Hey everyone, welcome into tonight's Fireside Chat where the topic is going to be on the economies of the 1920s. And this is going to definitely set up our conversation tomorrow in class while talking about the Great Depression, a defining moment in American history. Recall from today's brief discussion where I talked about the presidencies of Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge. I mentioned that term, laissez-faire economics, hands off. The government was taking a very hands-off approach to the American economy throughout the 1920s, and heck, why not? The American economy, like culture and celebrities and sports and technology and organized crime, all these components in the 1920s, African-American culture, everything was roaring, including the economy. One of the things that allowed for the government to sort of take this hands-off approach was that the American economy was surging. And a lot of this had to do with a revolutionary technique that was being developed in factories around America. And this revolutionary technique was specifically helping one industry help propel America into a great boom period of the economy. And that's the assembly line. The assembly line is a function in which factories were able to mass produce. There's the key term. Mass produce goods with incredible speed. Factory workers could operate essentially conveyor belts within factories, and that would allow for certain parts of certain machines to be rapidly built in succession, all while workers were positioned and stationed all around the factories, and everything just kind of moved and flowed throughout the production of a particular good. The assembly line really transformed the American factory system, and not just the United States factory system either. This was a worldwide phenomena. And the factory system was irrevocably changed by the assembly line production techniques. But one industry in particular which pioneered and sort of made the assembly line successful is the automobile industry, cars. Cars were first invented in the late 1800s, but they didn't become mass-produced until assembly line techniques were developed. And I keep using that term mass production because that is one of the themes of the 1920s. Goods, whether it be the car, refrigerators, sewing machines, household products, washing machines, etc. These were all being mass produced in a way that really allowed for the cost of these goods to go down. The more products that there were, the prices of those products were going down, making them thus easier to buy. And that is a true story about the car. When the automobile was first produced, it was very rare for people to own cars. But assembly line techniques allowed for cars to be made with much greater speed, and thus more cars could be made. A lot of people get it twisted when they think that one particular automobile manufacturer pioneered the assembly line. But in fact, one of the first car manufacturers to use the assembly line was Ransom Olds, who made a car known as the Oldsmobile, a car that no longer actually exists still today. They don't make Oldsmobiles anymore. But Ransom Olds was one of the first car manufacturers to use the assembly line techniques, production techniques, in manufacturing cars, and his cars became very cheap, easy to afford. But speaking of the word afford, our tie here to the automobile manufacturer who firmly is and forever tied to the assembly line was Henry Ford. And Henry Ford, his automobile company, based it outside of Detroit, Michigan, the car manufacturing capital of America, thanks to Henry Ford. Ford also adopted assembly line techniques, and Ford, like Ransom Olds, made cars quickly and cheaply. And that was one of the real keys to the rise in popularity of Henry Ford's Model T car, which forever changed the landscape of America. The car meant freedom. It meant that people could travel on their own. They were not restricted to public transportation. It meant that people had more access to society. It meant that people could move around more freely. It also came with some negative consequences: automobile accidents, traffic, overcrowded. But Ford's automobile and other automobile manufacturers really pioneered production techniques in an era when the assembly line was helping mass produce goods. And mass production leads to mass consumption. Think of that like a math formula or a scientific principle. Mass production leads to mass consumption. The more products that are being produced, the more people can consume, the more people can buy. And again, like I mentioned, it's not just automobiles we're talking about here. But there's a downfall to this development. While certainly the automobile helped transform people's everyday lives, mass production leading to mass consumption meant that people were buying more products than ever before. There was a craze, a shopping craze, and people were buying and buying and buying. And this led to the development of credit cards or buying on credit, meaning you pay for something up front even though you don't have the money for it. You're able to buy that on credit. It's the same idea as a credit card. When you buy something on a credit card, like a new PS4 game, you're not actually giving that $60 to the register at Albertsons where Vishruth shops and is going to someday own a series of Albertsons. Rather, you use your credit card, and then at a certain date, you end up paying that money back. Well, a lot of Americans were being allowed to buy on credit. The laissez-faire attitudes were permeating into banks, and banks were allowing people to buy houses on credit. People could buy automobiles, household goods, whatever the case may be. They're paying for everything on credit. And the question is, what happens if you can't pay it back? What happens if in the end you can't pay back what you owe? Well, that's how people start losing their money. That's how people start going bankrupt. Many Americans found themselves in a vicious cycle of buying on credit. And ultimately, what we'll be looking at, one of the definitive causes of America's economic Great Depression is buying on credit. And buying on credit flows back to mass production, mass consumption. These all tie together, as everything we've done this week really has. Really, when you think about it, everything we've done this week really all ties together. And this culture, this boom time, this surge and this roaring 20s, these attitudes and the development of all these different components of American life are ultimately going to come crashing down. And when they come crashing down, this is going to really shock America and set America back many years as far as its economics are concerned. And there will be a great number of lessons that Americans take away from the Great Depression. And while we're certainly not going to sit here and cover every itty bit part of the Great Depression, one thing I wanted to make sure that we have down before the weekend is a strong foundation in some of the underlying causes of the Great Depression. And so that's why I felt like today's class was super important. Not only did we today's Fireside Chat, not only did we solidify the automobile's importance, joining planes and the radio as some of the most important 1920s technologies, but that idea that mass production leads to mass consumption. America was on a feeding frenzy, a shopping frenzy, and buying everything on credit was only going to lead to people being in bad financial situations. And like I mentioned, when the house comes falling down, everything's going to crumble with it. And that's going to be something we hit tomorrow with the Great Depression. So I'll leave you with a very short Fireside Chat on mass production, assembly line, automobiles, buying on credit, mass consumption, and all these factors are going to wind up eventually leading us into a discussion on the Great Depression tomorrow. So I bid you farewell. Have a great Wednesday evening, everybody. Take care and have a good night. Oh, the past shapes the future. How could I forget? Take care.